Something happened this morning that will reshape North America. And I don't think most people understand just how big this is yet. At 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the President of the United States issued a threat so extreme that even seasoned trade analysts had to read it twice to believe it. 100% tariffs. Not on some products, not on certain categories, on everything. Every single Canadian good entering America would have its price doubled overnight. The reason? Canada signed a deal with China. Now I know what you're thinking. Another tariff story. Another Trump ultimatum. Another day ending in Y. But stay with me here, because what's actually unfolding, what's happening right now while you're watching this, isn't just another trade dispute. This is the unraveling of a 75-year partnership. This is the moment when North America's most successful economic alliance reaches a breaking point. And the next 6 months will decide whether it survives. Let me show you how we got here. Because this story doesn't start with a threat. It starts with something nobody saw coming. 1 week ago, that's when everything changed. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, boards a plane to Beijing. And this matters more than you might think. Because this isn't just any diplomatic trip. This is the first time a Canadian leader has set foot in China in 8 years. 8 years. Think about what that means. Nearly a decade of diplomatic silence between two countries that should, by all logic, be close trading partners. Nearly a decade of frozen trade relationships, of barriers and counter-barriers, of farmers losing markets, and fishermen losing buyers, and everyone pretending this was somehow sustainable. And Carney decides to end it. Just like that. Picture this moment, the Great Hall of the People. If you've never seen it, it's this massive structure in Beijing, designed to make you feel small, to remind you that you're standing in the heart of a civilization that's been around for thousands of years. Carney walks in. Xi Jinping is waiting. Cameras everywhere. The weight of 8 years of failure hanging over everything. They talk for hours behind closed doors, and when they come out, they've done something that would have been impossible just months ago. Here's the deal, and these numbers are crucial. Canada agrees to let 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market every year at just 6.1% tariff. Not the 100% tariffs that were in place, not even something in the middle, just 6.1%. In return, China drops tariffs on Canadian canola from 85%, which was basically a ban, down to 15%. They eliminate tariffs completely on Canadian lobster, crab, all seafood. Carney calls it a landmark agreement, a new beginning, the reset everyone had been waiting for. And here's the part that should make your ears perk up. 2 years ago, Canada had 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, exactly the same as the United States. Mirror policies, perfect alignment. That's how it always worked. Canada and America moved together on China, like they'd been doing for decades. But not anymore. Now Canada is going its own way, and the reaction at home tells you everything about why this matters. In Saskatchewan and Manitoba, the prairie provinces, farmers are celebrating, actually celebrating. Canola is their lifeblood, their entire economy. When China hit them with retaliatory tariffs 2 years back, farmers who'd been working the same land for generations suddenly couldn't pay their mortgages, couldn't keep their equipment, watched their life's work dissolve because of a trade war they had nothing to do with. Now they see hope. Premier Scott Moe calls it very good news, but that's Canadian understatement. Behind closed doors, provincial officials are calling it a miracle. The Atlantic coast is thrilled too. Lobstermen in Nova Scotia, crab fishers in Newfoundland, they've been locked out of the Chinese market so long they'd almost given up. Now they're talking expansion. New boats, hiring again. But in Ontario, where hundreds of thousands of people work in auto manufacturing, Premier Doug Ford is livid. He goes on TV and calls Chinese electric vehicles spy cars on wheels. He warns that this deal will tick off our American partners. And brother, he has no idea how right he is. Because 5 days later, Carney's on another plane, this time to Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, where the world's elite gather every January. And where, coincidentally, Donald Trump will also be speaking. What happens next in Davos becomes the spark that ignites everything. Let me set the scene for you. Davos isn't just a conference. It's where reputations are made or destroyed, where world leaders position themselves, where every word gets analyzed by thousands of journalists and broadcast to millions. January 20th, Tuesday. The Congress Center is packed beyond capacity, standing room only, world leaders in the front rows, CEOs of every company you've ever heard of, cameras pointed at the stage from every angle. Carney walks up to the podium, and he delivers a speech that changes everything. "We are in the midst of a rupture," he says. His voice is calm, but there's something underneath it. Something harder. Not a transition. A rupture. The old order is finished. It's not returning. He never says Trump's name. Doesn't need to. Every single person in that room knows exactly what he's talking about. You can feel the energy change. People putting their phones down. Leaning forward. Because this isn't the usual diplomatic doublespeak where everyone says everything and nothing at the same time. This is a line being drawn. Carney talks about coercion, about great powers using economic leverage as a weapon, about supply chains being treated as vulnerabilities to exploit instead of partnerships to strengthen, about middle powers like Canada needing to stand together because, and this line gets quoted everywhere, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. The room erupts. Not polite applause, a genuine standing ovation. In a room full of American business leaders and European officials who've spent a year watching Trump threaten allies, demand territory, treat agreements like suggestions, Carney's message lands like thunder. He's saying what everyone's been thinking, but nobody's been willing to say out loud. Then the next day, Trump takes the stage. And oh boy, it's vintage Trump. The speech wanders. He congratulates himself. He threatens. He digresses into topics nobody asked about. He talks about Greenland again, demands Denmark hand it over or face consequences. He mocks foreign leaders, doesn't name them, but everyone knows who he means, for their terrible negotiating skills. And then he gets to Canada. Canada lives because of the United States, Trump says. He's pointing now, jabbing his finger at the audience. They exist because we allow them to exist. Remember that, Mark, next time you want to make speeches. It's personal. It's designed to humiliate. The kind of statement that's supposed to make leaders back down, apologize, quietly abandon whatever policy caused offense. But Carney doesn't back down. His response goes viral within minutes. Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because it's Canadian, because of our values, our democracy, our strength. We're not your subordinate. We're a sovereign nation. And that response, that refusal to bend, triggers what comes next. Trump withdraws an invitation to something called the Board of Peace, this vague entity he created supposedly for Middle East negotiations, but which most allies see as a vanity project with a $1 billion membership fee. Trump acts like he's doing Carney a favor by rescinding it. Then come the social media posts. If you know Trump's pattern, you know what this means. He's furious, attacking Carney personally, attacking the China deal, calling Canada ungrateful, disloyal, foolish. And then this morning, the ultimatum that changes everything. 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if they proceed with the China agreement. 100%. Here's where I need you to really pay attention, because most news coverage is getting this completely wrong. The standard take goes like this. Trump's mad about the Davos speech. He's retaliating. He's being petty, letting his ego drive policy because Carney embarrassed him in front of the global elite. And look, yes, there's ego involved here. Trump doesn't handle criticism well. We've seen this pattern play out dozens of times. Someone defies him publicly, he hits back hard. That's who he is. But if you think this is just about ego, you're missing what's really happening. The 100% tariff threat isn't primarily about hurt feelings. It's about something much bigger, something that's been building for years, something that will define North American relations for the next generation. It's about the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal that Trump himself negotiated during his first term, the foundation of $2 trillion in annual trade. $2 trillion. That's the GDP of most countries. And here's what you need to understand. Here's the detail that makes everything else make sense. That agreement comes up for mandatory review in exactly 6 months, July 1st, 2026. By that date, all three countries have to sit down and affirm they want to keep this partnership going. If they don't, the agreement doesn't immediately die, but it enters a period of annual reviews that could stretch until 2036. After that, unless renewed, it expires completely. This review has been scheduled since the day the agreement was signed. It's not new. It's not a surprise. For the past year, all three governments have been preparing for it. Building negotiating teams, running economic models, planning strategy. Canada and Mexico thought this would be routine. Some technical updates, maybe modernize a few provisions, business as usual. The kind of thing trade bureaucrats handle without much public attention. But then Trump won his second term. And suddenly routine becomes existential. Because Trump has made it abundantly clear he views the current trade relationship as a bad deal for America. He's already imposed 35% tariffs on most Canadian goods. He's threatened to abandon the agreement entirely. He's talked about replacing it with separate bilateral deals that would give him more leverage over each country individually. And here's where China enters the picture. Because Trump's team has this theory, and this theory drives a lot of what's happening right now. The theory goes something like this, and you need to understand it because it's the foundation of Trump's entire strategy. Chinese companies are using Canada and Mexico as backdoors to get around American tariffs. They ship components, or partially finished goods, to factories north and south of the border. Those factories do minimal assembly, just enough work to technically qualify the product as Canadian or Mexican under the rules of origin. Then, the finished product crosses into the United States, tariff-free under the trade agreement, even though most of its value was created in China. Is this actually happening on a massive scale? Well, that gets complicated. There's definitely evidence of increased Chinese investment in Mexican and Canadian manufacturing. A Brookings study from last year found patterns, especially in sectors hit by U.S. tariffs: cabinet makers, steel processors, electronics assembly. The kind of industries where you could feasibly set up shop, do final processing, and ship products across the border. But the study also points out that proving transshipment is incredibly difficult because modern supply chains are genuinely complex, genuinely international. A car built in Ontario might have hundreds of parts from dozens of countries: engine block from Mexico, transmission from Japan, electronics from Korea, seats from the U.S., windshield from Canada, steel from who knows where. At what point does it stop being a Canadian car? Where's the line? Trump's team doesn't care about that nuance. They see a pattern. US tariffs on China go up, Chinese investment in Mexico and Canada increases. Exports from those countries to the US rise. To them, that's proof enough. And Carney's decision to allow 49,000 Chinese EVs into Canada at 6% tariff while the US maintains 100% tariffs, that looks exactly like the backdoor arrangement they've been warning about. Now, let me be really clear about what the Canada-China EV deal actually does, because details matter here. It doesn't eliminate Canadian tariffs on Chinese EVs entirely. It creates a quota. 49,000 vehicles per year get the lower rate. That's roughly the same number that were coming in during 2023, before the tariff war started. Carney frames this as restoring the status quo, not creating new vulnerabilities. And critically, these vehicles are for the Canadian market. They're not automatically eligible to cross into the United States duty-free. To do that, they'd need to meet the strict rules of origin, which require 75% of a vehicle's value to come from North America. A Chinese-made EV, built in China, sold in Canada, doesn't meet that standard. But Trump isn't interested in technicalities. His concern, at least publicly, is that this is just the beginning. Today, it's 49,000 vehicles for Canadian buyers. Tomorrow, it's Chinese companies like BYD building assembly plants in Ontario to exploit the trade agreement. Next year, it's electric vehicles rolling off Canadian production lines, technically meeting rules of origin because final assembly happened in Canada, but with all the high-value components, batteries, motors, electronics, sourced from China. And from a strategic perspective, If you're trying to build what Trump's advisors call Fortress North America, an economic zone that doesn't depend on Chinese manufacturing for critical goods, then having your northern neighbor simultaneously deepening ties with Beijing undermines everything. You can't build high walls on one border while leaving open doors on another, not when those borders connect. But here's what Trump's strategy misses. Here's the crucial piece his approach doesn't account for. Canada isn't moving closer to China because Carney has some ideological preference for Beijing. Canada isn't doing this because they're naive about the Chinese Communist Party or because they don't understand the strategic competition between Washington and Beijing. Canada is moving closer to China because Trump made it impossible to rely exclusively on the United States. Let me say that differently. Trump's own actions pushed Canada toward this deal. When you threaten your closest ally with annexation, when you post maps showing Canada as the 51st state, when you call their Prime Minister Governor Carney, when you impose tariffs on energy and manufactured goods for reasons that have nothing to do with economics and everything to do with looking tough for your base, you force that ally to look elsewhere. You force diversification. Carney said exactly this in Davos, though more diplomatically. Our old relationship with the United States, built on steadily increased integration, on the assumption of permanent partnership, that relationship is over. Translation: Canada can't afford to put everything in the American basket anymore. Not when that basket might get kicked over at any moment for reasons that have nothing to do with Canadian policy and everything to do with American political theater. So Canada is diversifying. That's Carney's word. He uses it constantly. Building relationships with China, the EU, Indonesia, India, Japan, anywhere that will treat Canada as an equal partner instead of a subordinate. Reducing dependence on the United States from the current 75% of Canadian exports. Think about that concentration for a second. 3/4 of everything Canada sells abroad goes to one buyer. That's not a partnership. That's dependence. That's vulnerability. Carney has set a goal of increasing exports to China by 50% by 2030. That's not modest tweaking. That's fundamental reorientation of Canadian trade strategy. And that reorientation is precisely what Trump is trying to prevent with the 100% tariff threat. Because if Canada succeeds in diversifying, American leverage evaporates. It just disappears. Right now, Washington threatens tariffs, and Ottawa listens because losing American market access would crater the Canadian economy. But in a world where Canada has robust alternative markets, where Chinese and European and Asian buyers can absorb what America rejects, those threats lose their teeth. And without that leverage, Trump's entire approach to managing allies falls apart. This brings us to why the next 6 months matter so much. Why this isn't just another trade spat that'll blow over. Everything happening right now, every threat and counter-threat, every deal with alternative partners, every public confrontation, it's all positioning for July. For when the three countries sit down to review the trade agreement, Trump wants to renegotiate on his terms. Tighter rules of origin, explicit provisions targeting Chinese transshipment, requirements that Canada and Mexico align their China policies with American policy, meaning high tariffs, restricted investment, treating Chinese companies with suspicion. He wants to use the review to lock Canada and Mexico into America's competition with China, whether they want to be locked in or not. Canada and Mexico want stability. They want the agreement to continue largely as written. They want tariff certainty so businesses can plan without worrying the rules will change every time Trump gets angry. They want the economic integration that's made North America one of the most productive regions on Earth. But they also want sovereignty, the ability to make their own foreign policy decisions, their own trade agreements, their own strategic choices. And that desire for sovereignty is colliding head-on with Trump's demand for alignment. Here's the scary part. Trump might not be bluffing about the 100% tariffs. Multiple legal challenges to his tariff authority have failed. A federal court ruled last year that his use of emergency powers was illegal, but appeals courts reversed those decisions. Conservative judges have consistently sided with expansive views of presidential power on trade. Trump appears to have the legal authority to do whatever he wants on tariffs, at least until Congress reasserts itself, which seems unlikely with Republican control of both houses. So if Trump says 100% tariffs, he probably means it. The question isn't whether he can, it's whether he'll actually follow through if Canada calls his bluff. Because 100% tariffs on Canadian goods would be catastrophic. And not just for Canada, for both countries. Let me give you numbers that illustrate the scale. Canada is the top export destination for 36 US states. 36. If you're manufacturing anything in Michigan, farming in Montana, running tech in Washington, Canada is probably one of your biggest markets. $3 billion in goods and services cross the border every single day. Not annually, daily. 3 billion. 60% of US crude oil imports come from Canada. 85% of electricity imports. When Texas had that power crisis, Canadian electricity kept lights on across the northern states. Canada is America's largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, uranium for nuclear plants, lumber for home construction. If you double the price of all those imports overnight, you don't just hurt Canada, you devastate American industries that depend on them. Auto manufacturers that source Canadian parts suddenly can't compete. Refineries designed to process Canadian heavy crude can't just switch sources overnight. Construction companies face lumber shortages. Energy companies face blackouts during peak demand. The Tax Foundation estimates Trump's existing tariffs already cost the average American household about $1,000 per year. $1,000. That's groceries, gas, building materials, electronics. 100% tariffs on Canada would push that to $2,000, maybe $3,000 per household per year. That's the kind of price shock that triggers recession. Supply chain collapse, mass layoffs. Trump claims American companies will simply switch to domestic suppliers. That short-term pain leads to long-term strength. But that's not how supply chains work. You can't replace overnight relationships built over decades, optimized through years of trial and error, based on investments in specialized equipment and trained workers and logistics networks. You can't flip a switch and suddenly have enough domestic steel production or refineries configured for different crude or lumber mills to meet demand. These things take years. They require massive capital investment that companies won't make if they think tariffs might reverse in 6 months when political pressure becomes unbearable. So conventional wisdom says Trump's using the threat as leverage. He wants to scare Canada, force Carney to back away from the China deal, come to Washington apologizing, agree to align Canadian policy with American interests. But here's why that might not work. Carney has done something no recent Canadian leader has done. He's publicly, definitively, in front of the entire world, established that Canada has alternatives. The China deal isn't just about trade. It's a signal, a demonstration, proof that Canada can and will look elsewhere if treated as a subordinate rather than a partner. And that signal is resonating everywhere. Mexico is watching. Europe is watching. Asia is watching. They're all asking the same question. If the United States threatens its closest ally, its largest trading partner, a country that fought alongside America in 2 world wars, with economic ruin over 1 trade agreement, what might they do to us? This is the cost that doesn't show up in economic models. The erosion of trust. The sense among allies that America can't be relied upon, that agreements are temporary, that today's commitment is tomorrow's bargaining chip. You can't quantify that in dollars. But it has real consequences. When European leaders talk openly about strategic autonomy, about building military capabilities without relying on NATO, that's a consequence. When Asian allies expand cooperation with each other instead of through American command structures, make plans that don't assume American support, that's a consequence. When Canada deliberately reduces dependence on the American market, that's a consequence. These are signs of a tectonic shift in how the world views American leadership. The post-World War II order was built on American credibility, on the idea that Washington would honor commitments even when inconvenient, that it would defend allies, maintain open markets, provide stable, predictable leadership that made long-term planning possible. Trump's approach erodes that credibility with every threat, every reversal, every tariff imposed for reasons unrelated to trade and entirely about forcing compliance. So what happens now? What should we be watching? Watch Canada's response. Carney hasn't issued a full official statement about Trump's threat yet. When he does, tone matters enormously. Does he back down? Offer to renegotiate the China deal? Find some face-saving compromise? That suggests Trump's leverage worked. Or does he hold firm? Make clear Canada won't be bullied into abandoning trade agreements, that Canadian sovereignty isn't negotiable. That signals we're heading toward real confrontation. Watch the trade agreement review. Formal negotiations start in weeks, though preliminary talks have been happening quietly for months. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has made clear rules of origin, and Chinese transshipment are his top priorities. If Canada and Mexico agree to significant tightening in exchange for tariff certainty, we might see a negotiated resolution. Everyone gives a little, everyone claims victory, the partnership survives. But if positions remain far apart, if Trump keeps threatening while Canada and Mexico demand respect for sovereignty, July could be when the entire agreement unravels. And if that happens, if the most successful free trade partnership in the Western Hemisphere collapses, the economic consequences ripple globally. Because North American economic integration isn't just about trade volumes or GDP statistics. It's about deeply intertwined supply chains, optimized over 3 decades. An auto manufacturer in Michigan doesn't just buy Canadian parts. Those parts are designed collaboratively with Canadian engineers, manufactured with specialized equipment that exists because of long-term investments predicated on stable market access. Components cross borders multiple times during production, moving through different assembly and processing stages. A single car might cross the border 6 or 7 times before completion, with value added at each step in each country. You can't replicate that quickly. You can't impose 100% tariffs and expect adaptation. What actually happens is production stops, factories close, workers get laid off. And because these supply chains are integrated across borders, when American factories shut down, Canadian and Mexican factories shut down too. The pain is mutual, the damage is shared. Recovery, if it happens, takes years. Trump believes this pain gives him leverage, that Canada and Mexico will blink first because they need America more than America needs them. On paper, looking purely at economic size, he might be right. Canada's economy is smaller, more trade-dependent, more vulnerable. In a pure economic contest, America has more resources, can sustain damage longer. But this isn't just economic. It's about sovereignty and self-respect and how you want the world to see you. Carney has apparently calculated that the long-term cost of submitting to Trump's demands exceeds the short-term pain of standing firm. That allowing the United States to dictate Canadian trade policy, to veto foreign policy decisions, to treat Canada as less than sovereign, sets a precedent Canada can't accept. Because if you bend once, you'll be asked to bend again and again, until bending defines you, until sovereignty becomes a word you say but don't mean. That calculation might prove correct or catastrophically wrong. We'll find out over the next 6 months. Because something has to give. Either Trump backs away from the threat, tacitly accepting Canada will maintain its China relationship, accepting he can't control every ally's foreign policy decision, or he follows through, triggering an economic crisis that could define his second term, turn voters against him, hand Democrats a winning issue. Or Canada blinks, accepts American terms, and the Davos speech becomes empty rhetoric everyone remembers but nobody takes seriously again. My read, watching Carney's trajectory this past year, analyzing his moves and rhetoric and positioning, is he's not blinking. I think he's chosen this confrontation deliberately. The China deal timing, the Davos speech, the public responses to Trump's threats, these aren't accidents or emotional reactions. They're strategy. Carney is betting Canada can withstand economic pressure better than Trump can withstand political pressure from American businesses and voters hurt by his tariffs. He's betting that when Montana farmers can't export beef to Canada, when Michigan auto workers lose jobs because production stops, when Texas energy companies face blackouts because Canadian electricity is cut off, Trump faces a political reckoning. It's a dangerous bet. History is full of leaders who underestimated Trump's willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term objectives. The man doesn't pivot easily, doesn't admit mistakes. He doubles down, but it's also a bet Carney may feel he has no choice but to make. Because the alternative, permanent subordination of Canadian interests to American demands. Accepting Canada has no agency, no sovereignty, no ability to make decisions Washington disapproves of. That's not sustainable either. No G7 leader can accept that and survive politically. So here we are. 6 months from the most important trade negotiation in a generation. Two leaders with public positions they can't easily abandon without looking weak. 100% tariffs hanging overhead like a sword. And underneath everything, a fundamental question going far beyond trade or tariff rates. Can the North American partnership survive when the United States treats allies like adversaries? This question matters beyond trade statistics or GDP or quarterly earnings. It matters because the answer shapes the world our children inherit. A world where democracies cooperate, where allies trust each other, where agreements mean something, where smaller nations can maintain sovereignty without being crushed. Or a world where they fracture into competing blocks, where power is the only currency, where every relationship is transactional and temporary. We're about to find out which world we live in. The next 6 months will tell us whether institutions can constrain leaders who don't believe they should be constrained, whether allies can maintain relationships when one partner demands submission rather than partnership, whether the entire architecture of post-war trade and cooperation, the system that prevented major wars and lifted billions from poverty, can survive an American president who views it as an obstacle rather than an achievement. The 100% tariff threat isn't about electric vehicles or canola or wounded pride or even China. It's about whether rules still matter more than power. And right now, the answer to that question is genuinely in doubt. If this helped you understand what's really happening, if you appreciated the context most coverage is missing, if you want to know where this heads, hit that like button, subscribe, because this story is nowhere near finished. The next chapter gets written in July at the Trade Agreement Review, but there'll be developments before then. Official statements, trade missions, behind-the-scenes negotiations, economic indicators showing tariff impacts, political pressure building in both countries. And I'll be here walking you through every development, every consequence, every moment when stakes rise higher, every twist in this story that could reshape North America. Tell me in the comments, will Carney hold firm or will Canada ultimately bend? And more importantly, which outcome serves Canada's long-term interests better? Should Canada accept short-term economic pain to preserve sovereignty, or pragmatically accept American dominance to preserve prosperity? Because that's the calculation Carney's making right now, the impossible choice facing Canadian voters, one of the most consequential decisions any Canadian leader has made in decades, a decision that will echo for generations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one when this story takes its next inevitable turn, because it will. Count on it.